In this lecture, I'm going to talk about Adam Smith, who lived from 1723 to 1790. Let me first of all say something about the overall structure of the lecture. First, I'm going to say something about Smith himself. Next, I'm going to highlight some of the key themes from his Wealth of Nations, in particular the division of labour and its various ramifications. I'm then going to turn to his theory of moral sentiments. This contains Smith's ideas about morality and its foundations, but in a sense it also suggests how we might understand the legal foundations of the kind of society that he's describing in the Wealth of Nations. Finally, in the lecture, I'm going to talk about the disadvantages of commercial society and some of the broader lessons that we can draw from Smith's work. Let me start then by saying a little bit about Smith himself. He lived, as I mentioned, from 1723 to 1790. He was a Scot, and he worked variously as a lecturer, a tutor to a nobleman. He also worked as a customs official, and then also very much as a writer. His key works were, on the one side, his Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was published in 1759. His best-known book, I think, is his Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. But there are also a couple of other things which have been published posthumously, which in some ways are quite important. There is something called the Lectures on Jurisprudence, and there are also some things called the Lectures on Rhetoric and Belles Lettres. They were published posthumously, as I mentioned, and in fact they were compiled from students' notes. Professors today might be sort of rather worried about the idea of their students' notes being published. At the time when Smith was lecturing and teaching, it was quite common for students to make detailed transcripts and for these to be circulated. Why am I talking with you about Smith? Why really does he matter? Well, there are three things that I want to highlight. First of all, coming out of his work, there is a fascinating picture of what he called commercial society and how it functions. He really offers us an enormously powerful vision of what a commercial society is like. Second, Smith had and continues to have an important continuing ideological impact. For example, take the Reagan and Thatcher eras. Take the Reagan and Thatcher periods. One had, in that time, Adam Smith ties like this being worn by the various staffers. You'll see often in the pictures these Adam Smith ties. And this indicates the attraction of Smith's work to conservatives and sort of free marketeers of that period. On the other side, there's another kind of ideological impact too. Namely, that Smith in some of his writings depicted the disadvantages of commercial society and the problems of work in the advanced division of labour in terms that were graphic enough still to be quoted by Karl Marx, a leading critic of capitalism and of the sort of thing that the Thatcher and Reagan people favoured. Let me turn now to the Wealth of Nations, and in particular to the key theme within it of the division of labour. Adam Smith illustrates this by discussing the example of a pin-making workshop, and he talks about the enormous gains in productivity that come about as a result of specialization. He asks you to picture someone, just an individual, making pins, doing the entire job himself. To contrast this with a situation in which the making of pins is split up into many different operations. Some people specializing in making the heads of pins, others the shafts, others possibly folding the paper that they go into, and so on. And his argument is basically that if such operations are split up into lots of small operations and that these are then combined, you get an enormous growth in productivity and a huge growth in wealth. What is important in this, however, is that these operations need to be coordinated. Because clearly, if you have this stuff going on, and perhaps one person making pin heads and the other person pin shafts, suppose the person who's making pin heads really gets quite excited about it and churns out more and more and more of the things. The result is going in the end to be a horrible discoordination. I mean, the people going through the workshop will be having to tread their way over pin heads, which are going... So what you need in this setting is someone to coordinate these efforts. And in a workshop, this is clearly going to be done by the manager of the factory, or the manager of the works committee, or whatever. What is distinctive about Smith's account is that implicit within it you have the idea that the division of labour takes place not just within an individual workshop, but also more generally within society. That the people, say, who are making pins are making use of materials that other people are preparing and making from elsewhere, that those people also are specializing. But what is really significant in this aspect of his discussion is that the division of labor and the coordination of activity is there taking place not by having some grand equivalent in society of a manager, but rather by people being guided by prices and economic self-interest. What Smith offers is a situation, is a picture of a way in which activities in a society can be coordinated by people being guided by their self-interest and by putting their activities into those areas in which they get the highest return. They're guided by prices. And indeed, one gets coming out of Smith's work a picture of people's activities in a commercial society as being coordinated in this manner. A really neat illustration of a theme along these lines, which is to be found in Smith, was offered by an American economic publicist called Leonard Read, who gave the example of a pencil, which has subsequently been used by just about every economist who talks about these things ever since. But the theme is nonetheless worth going over. If you take something like a pencil, you have here graphite in the middle, some wood, some paint, a piece of metal, and an eraser made of rubber. What Reed suggested one should do is to consider just how many different people's activities are involved in the production of the pencil. Think, for example, of the timber, maybe being harvested from forests in the Pacific Northwest, by people who've no idea that their efforts are going in the end to make the pencil. The rubber here might possibly come from Malaysia. I don't know quite what the metal is, but this is being mined by someone from somewhere else. The paint, you get the picture. Many, many different people being involved in different activities, and you can take the thing a step further back as well, because the people who are cutting the timber aren't doing it with their bare hands, they're doing it with power saws and so on, which in turn are being made by yet other people. One has this picture of thousands, if not in a sense even millions of people being involved in a cooperative effort to make a pencil when they don't know who else is involved in this, they don't know what their activities are going to end up making, and where it's actually quite striking that they may not only not know one another, but if they did know one another, they may not actually like one another very much. But they are brought by this mechanism of self-interest and prices into a form of cooperation. This indeed illustrates a couple of broader themes from Smith's work. On the one side, he stresses very much that in a commercial society we get what we need from other people as a result of appealing to their self-interest rather than looking to their benevolence, rather than begging for their charity. So he offers this picture of a commercial society as one in which people are led to cooperate, to meet other people's needs being driven by self-interest. This doesn't mean that he didn't like benevolence or charity. He said rather, we've got this powerful mechanism which can accomplish things that these other mechanisms can't. In the case of the market, say as illustrated by the pencil, you have Smith talking about the way in which people are led by self-interest to cooperate and to produce things which they weren't deliberately intending to set about doing. And indeed, Smith generalizes from this, and in an expression which has subsequently become quite well known, he talks about people being guided as if by an invisible hand where what he means by this is that particularly self-interested actions, but sometimes others, lead to desirable social consequences which the individuals in question are setting out deliberately to bring about. So one can see this as being a sort of generalization of this picture of people as being guided by self-interest. You may say, but okay, but how does all of this stuff work? And are the unintended consequences of human action really always good? To answer this question, we need to move from his Wealth of Nations to his theory of moral sentiments. And on this issue of whether unintended consequences are always to the good, to look also at the final edition of his theory of moral sentiments, where he had a few second thoughts, and also at some of the ideas from his lectures on jurisprudence. Let me turn then to the theory of moral sentiments. One might ask, particularly in view of the broad discussion in the Wealth of Nations, does Smith think that people are simply self-interested? Well, the answer is actually no. He really has quite a fine feel for the different and rather complex moral motivations that people have got. And he also offers some distinctive and I think quite interesting ideas about how we can understand how human morality works. The ideas from the theory of moral sentiments also in Smith's work play a key role in explaining the legal and behavioral framework of the Wealth of Nations, and also why he thought that people would comply with it. Indeed, clearly, the ideas of the Wealth of Nations, and in particular this notion of people cooperating without deliberately intending to do that, are only going to work if people are guided by their self-interest to trade with one another, rather than being guided by their self-interest simply to rob one another. And it's the ideas, in a sense, of the theory of moral sentiments in the background which explains, on Smith's account, why people go along with the broad legal framework in that way, and why, in a sense, they behave in a moral manner, rather than being guided by their self-interest just to rob one another. The key ideas from the theory of moral sentiments are really, I think, these. First, Smith pictures us as wanting the approval of other people, of living our lives in a situation where we basically want other people to approve of what we're doing. Indeed, he talks about the way in which the reactions of other people serve as a kind of mirror in which we can see features of ourselves that we otherwise couldn't be conscious of. There's quite a nice image of this, which is offered in the work of Adam Smith's friend and Scottish compatriot David Hume, in which he said it's a bit like how we might discover that we've got bad breath. This isn't really, as it were, something you do on your own. It's rather that if you're talking, you see people sort of stepping back and wincing a little bit, you might think, is everything all right? And so you've got this picture that they're features of our conduct, features of our characters, which we can only tell by looking at other people's reactions to us. I suppose you might say it's a bit like discovering whether or not we're handsome or attractive. You have sort of no idea until you see how other people are reacting. Other people then make these judgments on us, and Smith's account then is that we're oriented towards these and that we then internalize those judgments. We seek, in a sense, to behave in ways that other people will approve of. But, and this is quite a big but important but, other people may get things wrong. You may be behaving in a way that's perfectly reasonable, but other people disapprove of it because they may be biased against you. They may be ill-informed. And so what Smith runs with is this notion that what we do is to correct the actual judgments of people in the light of, how they would judge our conduct if they were properly informed. He talks in this context of the significance of the impartial spectator. Someone, as it were, who is there to the side, observing what's happening, not being passionately involved in it, but seeing really whether the kind of thing we're doing is the kind of thing that such an impartial spectator could approve of, or whether they disapprove of it. And what Smith offers is a picture in which we come to refine the judgments made by other specific people. We consider what the impartial spectator would make of our actions. We orientate ourselves in the light of that, and then we are guided by that. Indeed, he offers an account in which we internalize those judgments, tied it up, as it were, as our conscience. So Smith offers really a social account of our conscience. It isn't, for Smith, the voice of God inside us so much as a tidied up version of the judgments of our parents, our friends, and our neighbors. On Smith's view, thus, our conscience is a social product. Smith also has some ideas about social order, I mean, how a society works, and also about why we obey the law. He offers a brief account of this, but it seems to me really quite an interesting and suggestive one. He says, look, in part, people obey the law, go along with what the magistrates say and so on, because they perceive that it's useful. This, I think, isn't going to apply to most people, but it's the kind of thing where, I think, if you know someone very rich or a large landowner, they can clearly see the connection between their own self-interest and other people being law-abiding. But what about more ordinary people? Well, Smith here offers a kind of strange and rather interesting account which he talks about in the context of what he refers to as the theory of ranks, the theory of ranks in society. And what he suggests here is that there is an odd but rather intriguing mechanism at work in which ordinary people project their ideals of what a good life would be into the lives of those people who seem favored or fortunate. So if you take perhaps an ancestor of mine who was digging turnips and so on, he would see going past on the road the rich landowner in his carriage. Oh, you know, wouldn't it be marvelous to be up there? And what he does is project his ideals of a marvelous life onto this person, the reality of whose life may in some ways be rather ordinary and tedious. What Smith suggests is that we are then influenced by this picture of an idealized life which we project onto these characters and then do things to further their wishes, to go along with their judgments, even though there's nothing in it for us. You may think, well, isn't this all a little bit far-fetched? Well, in some ways it may seem to be, but consider the following. You may switch on the television, and you may see some product endorsement by some leading sports figure. You say, what's going on? You know, why should I buy sneakers because this particular person appears on? It seems to me that the advertising people are really pretty canny. They're certainly not going to give enormous amounts of money to these sports figures unless it actually had some effect on us. And I think it's not far-fetched to think of what's going on as being a mechanism a bit like that which Smith was appealing to. Namely, that we seem to be unduly influenced by the judgments of people who are in favored positions. Now, in Smith's own society, the people who were in favored positions were typically the landowners, rich merchants and so on, perhaps the king. And these would be people whose own judgments, for often quite pragmatic reasons, would be very much on the side of law and order, decent behavior, and so on. And what Smith was suggesting was that we are influenced by these people's judgments because of this rather odd mechanism. Smith also offers us some quite interesting ideas in terms of analysis and exploration and explanation of moral and legal codes. What he says, in effect, is that the ideas from the theory of moral sentiments, this business of sympathizing with the judgments that other people make, being affected by them and so on, produce different outcomes in different sorts of cultures. So that in a hunter-gatherer society, say, for example, people may judge very favorably extraordinary acts of bravery. Whereas in a society like ours, we might feel that the people who are behaving in this way are really being rather foolish. So what Smith offers is an explanatory theory which says that what spectators will go along with will differ in different kinds of societies, and that this may serve to explain where you get different kinds of moral codes in different societies. He also has some ideas about how notions of justice emerge. And what he suggests here is that we may react particularly to injustice. We may see something that really isn't right, that really isn't just, and that in a sense notions of justice and notions of law come as a result of people working these ideas together and thinking about them in more systematic form. Finally, concerning the theory of moral sentiments, one might ask, does Smith have an uncritical view about the desirable consequences of self-interest and of, as it were, natural mechanisms of human motivation more generally? I think one might indeed say that that's right concerning the first edition of Smith's theory of moral sentiments. But as Smith got a bit older, he became a bit less optimistic. And in this context, it's important to pay attention to what he says about the disadvantages of commercial society. One gets this, for example, in the Lectures on Jurisprudence and in The Wealth of Nations. What does he have to say here? Well, first, he discusses the disadvantages of the division of labour, both physical and mental. On the one side, he says, look, if people are spending all their time making a trivial part of a pin, it may have bad consequences on their bodies. And we're now familiar with RSI and problems of this kind, where if people are just doing small, repetitive tasks, it may sort of badly affect their bodies. Smith was onto this already, and the very mechanism he was highlighting as producing wealth, he also says, brings with it these sorts of disadvantages. He also talked about the way in which, if people's concentration is narrowed onto some trivial operation, we might now think of it in terms of some mechanized conveyor belt kind of job, he said in the end, they may be quite rich, certainly better off than they were when they were in the countryside, but concentrating on such things all the time may make them really stupid. That there's a sense in which you may not be able to get them to engage in issues of politics. You may not be able to have a sensible discussion with them because it's had a crippling effect also on their minds. Smith, too, was concerned about some other problems concerning commercial society, and in particular about the problems that may occur if people move from life in a small village to a large, anonymous city of the kind that was growing up in the society that he was dealing with. What's the problem here? Well, Smith talks about the way in which if people are living in a small village, he has what Smith describes as a character to lose. What's this all about? Well, if you're in a small village, if you're up to no good, other people know you, other people notice. If you had too much to drink and go home singing loudly, the next day when you go down to the village store, there'll be gossip about it. If you're seen going off into a field with someone that you shouldn't be going off into a field, people will speak about it, they'll gossip about it, and so on. Contrast this, Smith says, with the situation where an ordinary person moves from a small village to a large city. They suddenly become anonymous. They suddenly realize that no one actually cares very much what they do, providing they don't break the law in a flagrant manner. No one even knows who they are, no one cares about it. And Smith was worried that the result of this would be that, in a sense, the operations of the mechanisms of the theory of moral sentiments would no longer work, because they really depended on your conduct being monitored by other people. If no one really cares who you are and what you're up to, then, Smith worried, people may fall into degeneracy and vice. I often, when I'm teaching students, think about this, because sometimes you talk to students about what goes on when they move away from home to the first time to university, one of the things that strikes them is suddenly, actually, no one really knows me. No one really cares very much what I'm doing. And Smith, in that situation, would be very worried about what would happen to the moral character of the students. In addition, there was a final revision of the theory of moral sentiments, which was published actually in the year that Smith died. And in this, he returns to the theme of the theory of ranks, which I was describing to you before as what keeps people in line. Because he there expressed some concerns about what happens if the rich people follow fashion. Why should he be concerned about this? Well, there's a sense in which the rich people, if they follow fashion, if they waste their money on expensive trinkets and so on, it doesn't really matter. They've got plenty of money to waste. What worried Smith was the operation of the mechanisms of the theory of ranks meant that these things would then influence ordinary people. And he was concerned about the way in which, given, as it were, his own theory about social stability and so on, made people go along with the judgments of the rich and the wealthy, that if they started to be bad role models, we'd say nowadays, then they would lead astray people to whom a lot of harm would be done. And again, one might think in this case, going back to the guy advertising sneakers, that it isn't always necessarily going to be to the best in our own society. What does this mean in terms of the wider lessons from Smith's work? Well, first of all, Smith offers a vision of commercial society, of an extended society in which people are trading with one another, as a self-coordinating mechanism. You don't require, on Smith's account, someone playing in relation to society the same role as is played by the manager in the factory. And it's this, indeed, which is why libertarians and market-oriented conservatives got so excited about Adam Smith and why they wore the Adam Smith ties, because they were reacting against notions about the planned society, and Smith seemed to be offering an account of society as being self-coordinating, not needing people in government to plan things. In addition, you have Smith talking about the way in which these things operate in the interests of everybody, not just the rich. Second, there's also a richness about Smith's account and an awareness of problems and complexities from which we can still learn. Above all, I think one can say, Smith has a fine sense of trade-offs. Note in particular that the very mechanism which in Smith's account generates wealth, the division of labour, is also responsible for the grave problems of commercial society, the bad effects on individuals. And what about those bad effects? Well, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith actually turns to this issue and says a little bit by way of remedies. What he says in this context is that there is a real, if somewhat limited, agenda for government to step in to remedy these matters, typically in Smith's account by way of the encouragement of education. He doesn't offer there a remedy for the physical disadvantages of labour, but he's certainly very concerned about moral decline. He's certainly very concerned about the problems of, in a sense, an impoverished viewpoint towards which this is leading. And in this context, Smith is arguing that there is a legitimate role for government. And in this context, it's quite important to note that despite what some of the people wearing the Adam Smith ties might say, Smith himself is not a dogmatic defender of laissez-faire. That's to say, he's someone who offers this powerful vision of commercial society, but he does allow room for a moderate amount of governmental intervention. All this, it seems to me, gives us quite a lot to think about, particularly concerning our own society. Do the benefits of the division of labour outweigh its disadvantages? Does, as Smith thought, the operation of commercial society work in ways that benefit the poor? Certainly if one looks at our own society as a commercial society, the very rich are doing pretty nicely. On Smith's account, he wanted to stress very strongly that this operated in such a way that the poor benefited as well. Is this really the case? One might also argue more generally, are the unintended consequences of the pursuit of self-interest always, or indeed by and large, to the good? Can we go along today with the kind of optimism about this stuff which Smith himself displayed? Indeed, these raise a whole lot of provocative questions, but on this note, I really need to conclude my presentation. May I finally remind you of what we have covered in the lecture. First, I gave a little bit by way of introduction to Smith and his background and his concerns. Second, I illustrated some of the key themes of The Wealth of Nations, in particular his account of the division of labour and its huge benefits. I talked then about Smith's ideas from the theory of moral sentiments, about his account of how morality operates, also his account of the legal framework, which is the setting for The Wealth of Nations, and his notions of the theory of ranks. And then finally, I turned to the issue of the disadvantages of commercial society, how they're to be weighed against some of the advantages, and in particular, what some of the broader lessons from Smith might be for looking at and understanding and evaluating issues as they come up in our own society. Thank you very much.